He hadn't laid a hand on another soul in 15 years. Not in anger, not in comfort, not in anything at all. And now, the first person to collapse at his feet was a ghost held together by bruises and terror. Wyatt Stone didn't ask for much from the world anymore. He had his piece of land, a small ranch carved out of the unforgiving Nevada rock, with nothing for company but the mournful wind and a past he'd sooner drink himself to death than speak of. He owned a cabin built with his own 2 hands, a well-worn Winchester, and a heart full of ghosts older than the gnarled junipers that dotted his property. But on that scorching afternoon, the silence of his self-imposed exile was shattered. She stumbled out from the sparse line of sun-bleached pines, moving as if the devil himself was breathing down her neck. Her feet were bare and blooded, her body shrouded in the tattered remains of a silk garment, a vibrant red now smeared with dirt and despair. Her arms were a tapestry of scrapes and deep scratches, her lips cracked and swollen. But it was her eyes that stopped him cold. They were vast and dark, holding horrors that no human being should ever have to witness. She took 3 more faltering steps onto his land before her legs gave out, and she crumpled to the dust right in front of him. There was no scream, no plea for help, just a broken whisper in a language he didn't understand, followed by a few halting English words as she clutched the ruined silk to her chest. "I beg you, just make it quick." Wyatt froze, his hand instinctively going to the Colt Peacemaker holstered at his hip. He'd seen men beg for death on the battlefield at Shiloh, their bodies torn apart by cannon fire. He'd never heard it from a woman who looked more like a broken doll. She wasn't bleeding much from any single wound, but a violent tremor racked her small frame, the kind of shaking that comes from a soul pushed far beyond its limits. He took a cautious step forward. She flinched, a raw, animal sound catching in her throat, but she was too weak to pull away. It was then that the tattered silk slipped from her shoulder, and the sight beneath it made a cold, hard knot form in his gut. Her back was a grotesque canvas of pain and humiliation. Burns, old and new, crisscrossed her skin. Thick, raised welts spoke of a whip or a rod. But worst of all were the brands. Twisted, intricate symbols had been seared into her flesh, a mark of ownership, a claim written in agony. It was the mark of the Black Canyon Mining Consortium, a ruthless outfit known for using indentured labor with no regard for the law. Wyatt felt the world tilt, the blistering Nevada sun replaced by the humid air of a Tennessee summer long ago. The war. The farmhouse. The girl he'd found too late, the one who had looked at him with that same shattered emptiness before the light left her eyes. He had been a boy then, a soldier following orders, and he had walked away, leaving her memory buried with so many others. He had sworn to himself, in that smoke-filled haze, never again. Never again would he walk away. Breaking from his stupor, he moved with a slow, deliberate steadiness that wouldn't spook a wild horse. He shrugged off his heavy duster, the canvas worn soft with years of use, and draped it over her trembling shoulders like a solemn promise. No words, no questions. He'd learned long ago that some wounds were too deep for words. Then, with a gentleness he thought he'd long since forgotten, he scooped her slight frame into his arms and carried her away from the hell that had spat her out. For the first time in over a decade, Wyatt Stone felt the stirrings of a purpose beyond simple survival. He thought he was carrying her toward safety, toward the end of her ordeal. He had no idea the real storm was just beginning to gather on the horizon. The cabin was a sanctuary of warmth and the scent of pine wood, but as dusk settled over the hills, the desert air turned sharp and cold. A summer breeze in these parts could feel like a blade against raw skin, and he knew she must be freezing. He laid her down carefully on the cot he rarely used, tucked against the far wall. She didn't speak or protest, her body curling into a tight ball, her small hands clutching the lapels of his duster as if it were the only solid thing in a world turned to smoke. Wyatt didn't press her with questions. He wouldn't know where to begin, and he could see the terror still swimming in her eyes. So he did what men like him, men forged in silence and solitude, always do. He turned to simple, honest work. He built a small, quiet fire in the pot-belly stove, not so much for the heat, but because the steady crackle and pop of burning cedar could give a silent room a living heartbeat. It was a sound of home, of safety, and he hoped some small part of her might recognize it. She remained on the cot, a still figure in the flickering firelight. Her eyes, however, were constantly in motion, darting around the small cabin, scanning the single door and the two shuttered windows as if expecting monsters to burst through them at any moment. Every creak of the floorboards, every gust of wind that rattled the shutters, sent a fresh tremor through her. Wyatt busied himself making coffee. The grounds were stale and the brew came out black, bitter, and strong enough to strip paint, but it gave his hands a task. He sat at his small, scarred wooden table, nursing the hot mug, watching the flames dance in the stove. He stole glances at her every few minutes. Still breathing. Still silent. But the fierce, desperate way she clung to his duster told him everything he needed to know. The fire within her hadn't been completely extinguished. Hours bled into one another. Late into the night, as the fire died down to glowing embers, she stirred. Her head turned slowly on the pillow, and her dark eyes found his across the dim room. They held his gaze for a long, silent moment. There was no fear in them now, no pleading, just a flicker of raw, human connection, a silent acknowledgement from one survivor to another. He gave a slow, almost imperceptible nod, the kind of gesture shared between soldiers in a trench who knew that some things were better left unsaid. She seemed to understand, turning her head back toward the cold comfort of the wall. The next morning, as the first rays of sun cut through the dusty window pane, she spoke her first word. Water. Her voice was a dry, raspy whisper. He rose without a word and filled a tin cup from the bucket by the door. He approached her slowly, holding it out. No sudden movements. She pushed herself up with a wince, her hand shaking as she took the cup. She drank in long, slow sips, her eyes never leaving his face. When the cup was empty, she held it for a moment longer, her gaze more direct than before. That look held no thanks, nor did it ask for any more help. It was a simple, profound declaration, I am still here. What Wyatt couldn't know was that this single word, this one sip of water, was the first pebble in an avalanche. It would set in motion a chain of events that no fire, no Winchester, and no fortress of silence could ever hope to stop. She didn't say much more that day, or the next. Her responses were clipped, single words or short phrases, accompanied by cautious nods and watchful glances. She was like a doe that had barely escaped a wolf, still testing the safety of the meadow. But late in the afternoon on the third day, as Wyatt sat on his porch carving a new handle for an old axe, she stepped out of the cabin. She moved quietly, settling on the top step a few feet away from him, pulling his duster tighter around herself. For a long time, she just stared out at the vast, empty expanse of rock and scrub. Then, so softly he almost thought he'd imagined it, she spoke, her voice aimed at the horizon. They made me clean the mud from their boots. Wyatt kept his hand steady, the knife continuing its slow, rhythmic work on the piece of hickory. He didn't flinch, didn't turn to look at her. He just nodded, letting her know he was listening. She whispered, as if remembering a name she hadn't heard in a long time. She kept going, her words coming in broken fragments, like pieces of a shattered pot. She spoke of a camp, a spur off the main railroad line, a place that didn't exist on any map. A private hell where men like her, brought over from China with false promises, were worked to death in a silver mine. They were property, not people. Punishments were swift and brutal. She told him she had tried to run away twice before. The first time, they broke 2 of her fingers. The second time, they took a hot branding iron to her back. He didn't ask how she finally escaped the third time. He knew that story was for a day when she was stronger, a day when the ghosts weren't so close. Just as the sun began to dip below the jagged peaks, painting the sky in fiery shades of orange and purple, a sound cut through the evening stillness and stopped Wyatt's heart. Hoofbeats. More than one horse, moving fast, coming up the old ridge road. He was on his feet in an instant, the half-finished axe handle dropping to the porch. He grabbed the Winchester that was always leaning just inside the door and motioned for Mai to get back inside. She froze for a split second, her face a mask of pure terror, then scrambled back into the cabin with a speed born of instinct. The man who rode into the clearing wasn't a cowboy or a prospector. He was dressed in a fancy brocade vest and city trousers, all stained with dust and sweat. A greasy mustache failed to conceal the smug cruelty in his thin lips. He reined his horse to a halt 10 yards from the porch, his eyes immediately locking on the cabin door. "My! I know you're in there," he shouted, his voice dripping with venomous ownership. "You've got one chance to come back quiet before I burn this shack to the ground with you in it." Wyatt stepped down from the porch, the Winchester held loosely but purposefully in his hands. "She's not going anywhere." The man, clearly the leader, sneered. "That ain't your decision to make, old-timer. She's company property." His name was Bartholomew Finch, and his reputation for cruelty was known even out here in the Badlands. Wyatt didn't raise the rifle. He simply cocked it. The metallic schlick-schlack was louder than a gunshot in the tense silence. It was a sound that carried its own language, a clear reminder to Finch that this wasn't some back alley in Virginia City. This was Wyatt Stone's land, and he was the only law that mattered here. Finch's hand twitched near his own pistol, but he hesitated. He spat a wad of tobacco juice into the dirt, his eyes burning with a hateful promise. He wrenched his horse's reins, turning it around, and rode off without another word. But the look he threw over his shoulder was a contract written in blood. He would be back. And he would not be alone. Wyatt stood there for a long time after the sound of the hoofbeats had faded, the Winchester resting in the crook of his arm, his eyes scanning the tree line. Later that night, by the dim light of a kerosene lamp, he took out a piece of paper and a pencil stub and scribbled a short, terse note to an old friend who wore a sheriff's badge over in the next county. 3 days passed. They were quiet, but it wasn't a peaceful quiet. It was the heavy, charged silence that precedes a lightning strike, the kind of quiet where the wind itself seems to be holding its breath. Wyatt stayed close to the cabin, his vigilance a silent shield around them. He didn't tend to his meager herd, didn't check his trap lines. He just sat on the porch, cleaning his Winchester and his Colt with a methodical focus, as if preparing for a war he knew was inevitable. Mai understood. She watched him, and in her own way, she prepared too. She learned where he kept the extra ammunition, how to bar the door properly, how to stay low and out of sight. Then, on the afternoon of the 4th day, it happened. The air grew unnaturally still. The birds went silent. The incessant buzz of insects ceased. And then came the sound they'd been waiting for, a slow, deliberate cadence of hooves, the crunch of gravel and the whisper of dust rising on the ridge road. This time, there were 3 of them. They rode with the arrogant slouch of men who took what they wanted and didn't expect to be told no. Wyatt stood in the doorway, a solid, immovable object. Mai was just behind him in the shadows, her breath caught in her chest. Finch was in the lead, flanked by 2 hard-faced men with guns strapped to their thighs. "Last chance, old man," Finch called out, his voice flat and devoid of any pretense. "Step aside. Give me what's mine." Wyatt's reply was the cold, hard silence of the mountain itself. The rider on Finch's right shifted in his saddle, his hand drifting down, his fingers brushing the handle of his pistol. Wyatt didn't hesitate. He wasn't a young man anymore, but his reflexes were honed by a lifetime of survival. The Winchester came up, barked once, and the man screamed, toppling from his horse like a sack of feed, his leg gushing blood into the thirsty dust. The other 2 froze, their bravado evaporating in the sudden, shocking violence. They were killers, perhaps, but they were also cowards, unprepared for a fight that wasn't stacked in their favor. They sat on their horses, trapped between their bleeding companion and the unblinking old man in the doorway. It was then that another voice cut through the tension, calm, steady, and worn as old leather. "I'd think real hard about your next move, Finch." From the cover of the pines to the side of the cabin, a man emerged. He was tall and rangy, with a sun-weathered face and a silver star pinned to his vest. He held a rifle slung low, pointed at nothing and everything at once. Sheriff Clayton, Wyatt's old comrade from the war. Clayton fixed each of the riders with a gaze as hard as granite. "This here is my jurisdiction. And that woman," he said, nodding toward the cabin, "is now a material witness and under the protection of the law." "My protection." The wounded man groaned. His friend muttered a curse. Finch's face turned a mottled shade of red, but the fight had gone out of him. He knew Clayton's reputation. They turned their horses and retreated, dragging their bleeding companion with them, their departure a slow, humiliating crawl. Later, after the dust had settled, Wyatt poured Clayton a cup of his terrible coffee. "How'd you know to come?" Clayton took a sip and grimaced. "Wyatt, when you send a note that smells of gunpowder and 15 years of regret, I figure it's something more than a social call." He looked toward the cabin door, where Mai was now peeking out. "Some stories don't end with a bit of gunfire, my friend. They just get started." The dust settled for good this time. The cabin was quiet again, but it was a different kind of quiet. The heavy, waiting silence was gone, replaced by something lighter, something that allowed a man to hear his own breathing and not find fault with it. The ghosts were still there, but they seemed to have retreated to the shadows. Mai no longer hid. She still startled at the sound of a falling branch, and some nights Wyatt would hear her muffled cries as she fought battles in her sleep. But she was changing. She began to sit with him at the table for morning coffee, drinking it slowly from her own tin cup. She helped him gather firewood, her movements becoming less hesitant, more confident with each passing day. She asked him questions about the names of the birds, about the workings of the stove, about the scars on his hands. Little things. But when you've been stripped of everything, little things are all that matter. Wyatt noticed the changes in himself, too. He saw the way she would stand by the window in the morning, watching the sunrise, her face soft and unguarded. He heard her laugh once, a tiny, breathy sound that startled them both, when a clumsy squirrel dropped a pinecone on the roof. He found he didn't know what to do with the sound, with the feeling it stirred in the barren corners of his heart. He couldn't tell if he was fixing her, or if she was fixing him. Perhaps it didn't matter. One evening, she came inside with her hands full of tiny, resilient desert wildflowers and put them in a water glass on the windowsill. The splash of color was alien in the Spartan, masculine space. Wyatt didn't say a word, but the next morning, he took a broom and swept the porch clean for the first time in nearly a decade. They never spoke of what was growing between them. They didn't have a name for the quiet understanding, the shared space, the comfortable silence. It was enough that it existed. But one night, over a simple meal of rabbit stew, she looked up from her bowl, her dark eyes clear and steady. "Wyatt," she said, her voice soft but sure. "You ever think some people are put on this earth not to save other people, but to give them the space they need to save themselves?" He looked at her, at the resilient flower that had refused to be broken, and felt a truth in her words that resonated deep in his bones. He didn't answer, just gave her that same slow, understanding nod he'd given her on that first night. If he had tried to speak, the wrong words, words of a past he couldn't change and a future he didn't deserve, might have come out. And the silence was too precious to break. And that is how they lived. Two damaged souls in a small cabin, tending to a slow, patient healing that asked for no permission and required no explanation. Out here in the vast, lonely West, some stories don't end with a ride into the sunset. They are quieter, more profound. They are the stories of a swept porch, a glass of wildflowers, and the space between two people where hope can finally take root and grow.